What's up, guys? This is Hammer here again, back with another video. And today I'm going to be talking about North Africa, North Africans. As you guys remember, yesterday I made a video in regards to the Horn of Africa. And what I was advocating for in that video was that the Horn of Africa be separated from the Black diaspora. And what that essentially means is that the Horn of Africa will not be allowed to be classified as Black. And of course, one of the main reasons I used for this was the massive amounts of admixture. I also had other reasons in the video, and you guys can watch that video to find out. But one thing I said in that video was that I would do a follow-up video talking about North Africa, North Africans, and my problems with them too. And I guess that's what it's about. See, when it comes to North Africa, it's quite a unique situation because unlike the Horn of Africa, who are mixed between, indigenous Black people and Arabs and others, North Africa is 100%, I will say almost 99 to 100% non-Black, right? The vast majority of their genetic heritage comes from the Mediterranean and the Middle East. That's the reason why if I take someone from the Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, right? If you take those people anywhere in North Africa and you have a DNA test, right? I can promise you most of their DNA result is not going to be Black indigenous. Most of the DNA result is going to be whether Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, Arab, sometimes even European. So when you look at the history of that region, it is undeniable that the vast majority of people who live in North Africa, their lineage comes outside of the African continent. Now, why does this matter, right? You have a situation in which the vast majority of Black people, right, who live in Sub-Saharan Africa, right, they are indigenous, right? Black Africans are the indigenous group of the African continent. And North African, essentially, their lineage comes from outside the continent, which is why I don't view them as indigenous. So what this means is that you have a situation in which, although Black Africans have to be African all the time, North Africans are what I call part-time Africans. What does that mean, right? North Africans recognize that their lineage does not come from the continent. Their lineage comes from outside the continent, which is the reason why most of the loyalty lies with the Mediterranean and the Middle East, right? It's also the reason why most North African nations, if not all part of the Arab League. And so this creates a weird conflict because on one hand, genetically and politically, your allegiance is not with the African continent. But however, you occupy the African continent. But then, of course, the majority of people who occupy the African continent are Black Africans who are genetically, politically aligned with the continent itself, and they're indigenous to the continent. And so it creates a weird situation where North Africans sort of have to play both sides. So what they will do is they will go to Black Africans or Black African nations, right, and talk to them about how, we're proud to be African with this. But in practicality, their allegiance, both, genetically and politically, aligns with the Middle East and the Mediterranean. I'm like, you saw this with the recent case of Tunisia, which is the reason why I have the flag here as a photo. So recently, right, you had a situation in Tunisia in which Black African migrants were being murdered and killed. And you essentially had the president talking about how, these Black African migrants are trying to turn Tunisia, from an Arab country to an African country. Now, when he said that was true, because I'm like, but wait a minute. Tunisia is in the continent of Africa, right? I'm like, you guys occupy the continent. You occupy North Africa. But he said that, no, these Black migrants from Sub-Saharan Africa are trying to turn us into an African nation. But of course, very few people caught that. Of course, later on, he called for the nation to fight back. And before we knew it, there were videos coming out of Black Africans being killed, stabbed, and just brutalized in Tunisia. But I think for you to understand why this happens, you have to understand the sort of, dual politics, dual identities that North Africans have. And I think Black African nations don't understand. See, when North Africans talk to you and tell you that they're African, it is almost the exact same way as how the United States tells China that they believe in the one China policy. I'm going to give you an example, right? The U.S. technically is under the One China policy, which recognizes Taiwan as being part of China. And America will go to China and tell them, yeah, we believe that Taiwan is a part of you, blah, blah, right? But everybody knows that when America says this, they don't actually mean it. They don't actually believe that Taiwan should be part of mainland China. They just say that because they recognize that if they were to come out and let China know that, hey, we don't actually want Taiwan to be a part of you, they fear that China will retaliate or react against them, right? So they just tell China this to essentially, keep them at bay. That's how North Africans operate with Black Africans, right? They recognize that Black Africans make up the majority of the continent. They are the true indigenous people, and they're the only ones that are truly aligned politically and who are truly aligned politically with the African continent. In other words, because Black Africans are the true indigenous people of Africa, they are 100% African, and they are African all the time, right? They don't pick and choose, right? They view Africa as their indigenous territory, and so their loyalty to the continent is absolute. But when it comes to North Africans, because they recognize that their lineage, right, comes from outside of the continent, and because their allegiance tends to align with countries outside the continent, they're only part-time Africans, right? So they will go to Black African nations and tell them, oh, we're African, but once again, they don't actually believe that, right? Like the president said, right? They don't actually believe that. They recognize, right, that their lineage is mostly Mediterranean and Middle Eastern, and their allegiance is mostly with the countries that are outside of the African continent. But here's the issue. They also recognize that if they were to go out here and really tell Black African nations how they really feel, that, hey, we don't actually view ourselves as Africans, like we just occupy the territory. We just argue in Africa, right? But really, our allegiance is with the Mediterranean and with the Middle East. If they were to actually really tell Black Africans how they really view themselves, the fear they have is that Black Africans will come together and essentially ice them out. Because remember, right? Black Africans still make up the majority of the continent, right? And a great way for me to explain this is, like, for example, think of the U.S., right? In America, we try the best we can to dissuade white people from having a white identity, because you recognize that as minorities, right? If white people were to come together under a common white identity, they can fuck us over quickly. So it's best for us to convince them to not do that. North Africans recognize that the only way they can get away with abusing and putting hands on Black Africans is as long as they can convince Black Africans that they're African themselves, and also convince Black Africans to not unify. The moment Black Africans are able to recognize that, hey, you guys play both sides, you only claim to be African when it's convenient, but really you guys view yourself as being much more aligned with the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Right? You just so happen to occupy the African continent, but you don't actually view yourself as part of the continent. The fear they have is that once Black Africans realize this, they will come together and become a dominant group, the dominant group on the continent. And they will be able to essentially apply pressure on North Africa, which is still a minority. So it is in their best interest to keep Black African nations divided, to keep Black African nations separate, and to convince Black African nations that they themselves are African, right? Because this allows them to play both sides, right? And so when I said this, a long time ago, right? I've had so many Black Africans push back, telling me no. I said, dude, these people don't actually view us as African. See, Black African people, Black Africans are the true indigenous people. So in other words, because you're indigenous to the African continent, you have to be African 100% of the time. But when it comes to North Africans, because their genetic lineage comes from outside of Africa, they don't have to be African, right? They get to pick and choose. They become part-time Africans, right? Because just look at them. It's obvious that most of their genetics are not indigenous just by looking at them. And when you take a DNA test, it tells you this, right? But see, once again, I personally believe that, okay, why is it that North Africans would tell Black African nations, all the time how much they hate them, will call them a bead. Like North Africans tell black Africans all the time how, hey, they're not African, they view themselves as separate, they're part of the Arab League, right? They constantly separate themselves from you, but yet despite this, black Africans still try to include them. And I personally believe the reason why black Africans do this because, once again, they believe, a lot of black Africans believe that North African nations are better than them. Because if you look at the continent, right, some of the most developed economies are in North Africa. And so because many black Africans tend to view North African nations as being superior to them, even though these same North Africans will mistreat them, will beat them, will call them a bead, will tell them constantly how much they don't view themselves as African, how much they're Arabs, and how much they're the quote unquote Caucasian descent. Even though North Africans will tell black Africans this all the time, because black Africans view them as superior, they will try to claim them. And this is the reason why Tunisia can kill black Africans in the country and black African nations are silent. Now, here's the issue, right? If you were to have Nigerians being killed, I'm going to give you an example, right? When you had, for example, I'm going to give you an example, right? A couple of years ago, there was a situation in which a lot of black African migrants were being killed in South Africa, right? And I remember black African nations were in uproar. They were talking about it, and they were like, "Oh my God, how dare they kill Nigerians?" Right? Fine, but interesting how you guys had so much heat, so much to say when black South Africans were killing black African migrants, but the moment you see North Africans killing black Africans in Tunisia, all of a sudden you guys are quiet. I noticed you guys are really quiet. To a point where you got some African leaders who are going and shaking the hands of the president of Tunisia. I'm like, what the hell is going on? We got to stop playing this game when it comes to North Africans, okay? The reality of the conversation is this, right? We recognize that when it comes to the Horners, they're an admixed group. So because of this, they're confused and they cannot be included in what I call the black indigenous African, black sort of African black group, right? But when it comes to North Africa, they have demonstrated to black Africans time and time again that they don't like you and that they don't view themselves as African and that their allegiance aligns more with the Middle East and with Mediterraneans. They tell you this all the time. And I think instead of you guys trying to force them to be one of you, no, separate from them, cut them off. That's the reason why I feel like the African Union is a failure, because here's the issue. The African Union, right, and by including North Africans and Horn Africa was a mistake, because these people, for the most part, don't really align themselves with the continent. I'm like, Somalia is a part of the Arab League. Come on, man. Like, North Africans are part of the Arab. Like, their allegiance is not with the African continent. The only people that are truly aligned with the African continent are the indigenous black population. That's it. And they should be the ones that should define what Africa is. They should be the ones that should lead the continent. And so the problem I have with North Africans is that they, in my opinion, what I call part-time Africans, right? North Africans love to be part-time Africans. They only claim the African continent when it benefits them. But any other time, they are Arab, Mediterranean, and Middle Eastern. Any other time, they're separate. And you saw it when they were killing black Africans in Tunisia, talking about how, they're trying to change Tunisia from being an Arab country to an African country. But wait a minute. Tunisia is in Africa. It's in North Africa, right? But see, once again, you have to understand, right? Although Tunisia is part of Africa, the people who occupy Tunisia don't identify with the African continent. They identify more with the Arab and the Middle Eastern world. But once again, black Africans don't want to accept this because, once again, they view North Africa as superior to them, and they fear that if they officially cut them off, that they will no longer be able to claim them. We gotta start mentality. But anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. But like, look, we got to start accepting the reality of what it is. Okay, the African continent is now split between three sections. You have the Horners, who are a mixed group, right? They're confused, and many of them, especially Somalis, will actually align more with the Arabs compared to the African continent. You have North Africans who are purely non-black, and most of the lineage comes from outside the continent, right? And many of them will only claim to be African when it benefits them. They're what I call part-time Africans, right? Let's keep it real. And so you have a situation in which North Africans actually align more with those who are outside of the African continent. And then you have the third group, which is what I call the black indigenous people, right? Black indigenous Africans, right, are the only people on the African continent that are truly loyal to the African continent. They're the only people that are truly with Africa. And the reason is because that is their indigenous home. And until we accept that reality, we're going to keep seeing situations of black folks and black Africans being mistreated, being killed, and being beat in North Africa and being called a bead, just like what we saw in Tunisia. And with that being said, I'm going to close it off. You guys, tell me what you guys think in the chat. Do you agree and disagree? With that being said, hammer out.